remember that we ended our last study by saying that the Lord blessed the house of Obed-Edom, with whom David had decided to leave the Ark of the Covenant as he was afraid he wouldn't be able to meet all of God's requirements and demands in moving it to Jerusalem. But that blessing brought out an interesting characteristic of David, in my opinion. Hi, I'm Ken Godevanis, and this is Digging for Scriptural Gems. Thanks for joining us. Today we're studying 2 Samuel chapter 6, verses 12 to 15. Follow along in your Bibles. You can pause the video at any time to delve into anything that comes to mind from our study. Once again, I apologize if you hear any extraneous noises such as dogs or cars with loud motors. They seem to love making a lot of noise around this neighborhood where I am this beautiful August day. David heard that Obed-Edom's house and all that belonged to him was being blessed on account of the Ark of God. Now, of course, we can take much out of this, especially the idea that when we live in the presence of God, God was said to have lived in the Ark of, or on top of the Ark of the Covenant. We are blessed, undoubtedly. But as I read this short portion, I have to tell you that something else struck my perhaps rather unorthodox sense of interest. As soon as David heard Obed-Edom was being blessed, what did he do? He went and brought the Ark of God from Obed-Edom's house to Jerusalem. And the text says he did it with gladness. Yes, of course, David too wanted to live in the presence of God. I get it. But this is an actual taking of the ark physically from someone else who was helping you out and who was being blessed. Did this mean now that Obed-Edom would lose that blessing? I don't think for a moment that God operates like that. But let's focus on David for a moment. What changed? Was he no longer worried about God's specific rules for transporting the ark? Did he all of a sudden think no one would make any mistakes as Uzzah had made and was struck dead? I don't think so. One thing that changed was that David was missing out on some blessings. Is it possible that David was reacting out of personal interest and greed in this quick decision to bring the ark at this time to Jerusalem? He heard its current keeper was being blessed, and right away he went himself and got it or took it. And he did it, the text says, with gladness. Whose gladness? Well, perhaps his own. Matthew Henry suggests that the gladness was over the fact that David now felt, because he had blessed those that kept the ark for 3 months, that his anger, that God's anger had calmed down, and once again he wanted to bless Israel. Perhaps. This time the ark had been moved properly by proper bearers. David saw to that. And just after it was moved just 6 paces, David had them stop, and he sacrificed an ox and a fatling. Fatling is a young animal that has been fattened in readiness for slaughter for that very purpose. We should point out that a minority believe that these sacrifices were repeated several times along the route based on 1 Chronicles 15:26, where the story is retold, and we'll come to that later on in our studies. But we personally found little evidence for that beyond that verse, although the number of sacrifices in that reference do suggest a greater sacrifice than what is referred to in 2 Samuel here in our passage. At the same time, David danced before the Lord with all his might while wearing a linen ephod. Now, to participate in the dancing, David took off his royal garments and simply wore the common man's linen cloth. It's a mistake for us to think that David was immodest, as some do. 1 Chronicles chapter 15, verse 27 indicates that David was dressed just like all the other priests and Levites in the procession. Perhaps that was intended to show that this move was indeed for all the people of Israel. There was much shouting and lots of trumpet sounds. In Hebrew, the reference of the trumpet is to the shofar, the ram's horn trumpet. Now, David Gusick, the commentator, gives David full marks for his gladness, indicating that the king was thrilled. to know that the presence and glory of God could bring blessing instead of a curse. He was also glad to see that when they obeyed God, they were blessed. I'm not there totally myself, but that's a possibility. Guzik may have gotten his position from the fact that later on in 1 Chronicles chapter 15 and verse 13, we learn that David took the time to explain to the priests why God struck out against them in their first attempt to bring the ark back to Jerusalem, in saying, quote, "For because you did not do it the first time, the Lord our God broke out against us because we did not consult him about the proper order." There's a few things I like about that. It's because you did not do it the first time, the Lord our God broke out against us. He was taking some of the blame because we did not consult him. Probably he should have taken a lot of the blame. Anyway, he's now doing it in the proper way. He is now transporting the ark the way it should be. Now, with respect to the sacrifices, after going 6 paces, Guzik says, this was elaborate, excessive, over-the-top sacrifice. This excessive sacrifice communicated atonement, consecration, and longing for fellowship. This is also an appropriate passage for us to touch on the subject of dancing in worship. Yes, you heard me, dancing in worship. First of all, you should know I am not a dancer, never mind in worship, not anywhere. And it's not because I don't want to dance. Oh, how I wish I could. It's because I believe a snake with no feet can dance better than I would. But our text does imply that David danced exuberantly before the Lord as he moved the ark to Jerusalem. So what are we to think? Here's David Guzik on the topic. Quote, "We don't think that dancing is strange when the baseball player rounds the bases after hitting the winning home run. We don't think it is strange when the winning touchdown is scored or when our own child scores a goal. We think nothing at hands being raised at a concert or after a touchdown. We should not think them strange in worship to God." Unquote. Well, for me, the question of whether or not we are to dance during worship boils down to this. The Bible does not forbid it, but rather indicates in several places, as our current passage does, that dancing did take place, if not within a house of worship, certainly related to worship. As a result, for me at least, it's a matter of the local church or denominational tradition, the people's culture, and their specific background. It would be most acceptable to me, and even anticipated by me, to see dancing in a southern U.S. church made up almost entirely of black believers from the South, and not to see it during a worship service of high Anglicans or Episcopalians, if you like, in an upper-class British or American highbrow neighborhood. If there is to be dancing, however, I would expect it to be totally to the glory of God and not to draw attention to the dancer in any way. Sometimes, though, that's a bit too much to ask. Guzik also adds, quote, "From our knowledge of ancient and modern culture, we can surmise that David's dance wasn't a solo performance. He probably danced with simple rhythmic steps together with other men in the way one might see Orthodox Jewish men today dance. By the way, that's something I and my wife observed and enjoyed in Israel when we were there. In this context, David's linen ephod or cloth means he set aside his royal robes and dressed just like everyone else in the procession. We might also point out that David's dancing was appropriate in the context. This was a parade with a marching band, a grand procession. David's dancing fit right in. Now, if David did this as the nation gathered on the Day of Atonement, it would be out of context and wrong. As always, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this topic. It's one that many people spend hours discussing. We don't need to do that. In closing this study, I hope we pick up at least 2 ideas. First, we need to do things God's way. That's evident. Secondly, we're not to assume that when we see someone else doing something differently than the way we would do it, that that it is not, we're not to assume that it is not acceptable to God, unless the scriptures specifically tell us otherwise. God had told the Israelites how he wanted the ark moved. Nothing else would do. God had not told the Israelites that they couldn't dance in jubilation. As my grandchildren say to me, Grandpa, read the room, or in this case, know the scriptures. Next time we'll see how one of his wives treats David on this occasion. Not a pretty picture. Please join us for that as we learn from it. Please write to us with your comments and questions. Share the studies with others. Keep on studying on your own. And once again, I would urge you and thank you to subscribe to our YouTube channel, Digging for Scriptural Gems.